Good evening, my friend, and welcome to History After Sunset. I'm so glad you're here, where together we slow down, breathe deeply, and drift through the quiet corners of the past to rediscover the people, the choices, and the moments that shaped our world long after the lights went out. Have you ever wondered what could make an entire world tremble in fear of itself? Why, just as peace was found, the world split in two again, and how a war cold, silent, without a single battlefield, could still shape everything we live with today. Our borders, our beliefs, even our dreams of freedom? Tonight, beneath the gentle glow of dusk, let us listen to that story together. A story without clear heroes or villains, only people learning how to live with fear and still daring to dream of peace. When the last echoes of gunfire faded in 1945, the world should have felt peace. But what followed was not silence, it was a trembling stillness, the kind that comes before another storm. Cities like Berlin stood half in ruin, half in reconstruction, and amid the rubble, two superpowers began to look at each other not as allies, but as reflections of everything they feared. The United States and the Soviet Union had both fought against tyranny. Yet their visions for the world could not have been more different. One believed in freedom built on markets and votes. The other, in equality enforced through control. And between those two visions, the rest of the world was caught, hesitant, watchful, holding its breath. In Washington, men in gray suits spoke of containment, of keeping the red tide from spreading westward. In Moscow, party leaders warned that the West sought to strangle their revolution before it matured. The war was over, but the fear had only just begun. Fear of spies, of secrets, of ideas that could travel faster than bullets. As the sun set on Europe, new lines were being drawn across maps and minds. The Iron Curtain was not just a border, it was a state of mind. On one side, jazz played through cafe windows, neon lights flickered, and the promise of prosperity glimmered. On the other, factories marched like gray monoliths, and slogans of brotherhood filled the air. But both sides shared one thing: sleepless nights. For the first time in history, humanity realized it could destroy itself completely. Nuclear fire was no longer a myth. In deserts and tundras, bombs were tested, and with every explosion, the sky seemed to hold its breath a little longer. The images never reached television screens, yet the fear seeped quietly into everyday life. Children crouching under school desks, families building shelters in basements, lovers whispering, "See you tomorrow," as if tomorrow might not come. But the Cold War was never only about weapons. It was about hearts. Behind the slogans and speeches were ordinary people. Artists painting under censorship, scientists chasing the stars to prove their country's worth, and poets who smuggled hope into verses when truth became too dangerous to say aloud. In the late 1940s, a journalist once wrote that the world had entered a twilight between peace and war. He was right. It was neither day nor night, only the long dusk of suspicion, where every headline was a warning and every neighbor a possible spy. From the streets of Budapest to the corridors of Washington, everyone was watching and no one felt safe. In that fragile balance, something extraordinary began to happen. Fear turned into a strange kind of fuel. It drove nations to invent faster, build higher, and think deeper. Technology leapt forward: radar, rockets, computers, all born not from peace, but from the desire to never be left behind. Humanity, trapped between destruction and progress, kept running toward the future with one eye over its shoulder. Yet amid the rivalry, there were moments of tenderness too. Letters passed between soldiers stationed far from home. Artists painted peace on cracked walls. And in the stillness of night, radio waves crossed oceans, carrying music from one side of the Iron Curtain to the other. Somewhere, someone in Moscow hummed along to a song from New York, not knowing its name, but feeling, for a moment, that they were part of the same world after all. By 1949, Two worlds stood firm, each convinced of its righteousness. The Berlin airlift had already proven how far each side would go to claim a city's soul. In the East, Stalin's gaze hardened. In the West, Truman's resolve grew. Allies became rivals, rivals became symbols, and the planet became a chessboard where no move was small. Every night, diplomats drafted new alliances, while scientists designed the means to end them. Every dawn, new countries chose sides, sometimes willingly, often out of fear. Empires rose from the ashes of old colonies, and even the smallest nation found itself pulled into someone else's orbit. The Cold War was not cold at all. It simmered quietly, dangerously beneath polite smiles and political speeches. It was a tension that lived in every photograph, every broadcast, every silence after the word nuclear. And through it all, the world learned a strange truth, that peace could feel as heavy as war. Because peace built on fear is never quiet. It hums, it buzzes, it waits. That hum is what we now remember when we speak of the early days of the Cold War. Not just the politics or the borders, but the atmosphere, the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast, knowing that one misstep could end everything. In those uncertain years, humanity did not march into the future with confidence. It tiptoed. Every invention was shadowed by anxiety, every celebration by doubt. But even then, in the midst of suspicion, the human spirit endured. People still fell in love, still wrote songs, still looked up at the same moon and wondered whether someone on the other side of that invisible wall was looking back. History, after all, is not made of nations. It is made of nights like these when the world feels too fragile to hold, and yet somehow it does. When a single spark could destroy everything, but a single act of kindness could remind us why we endure. That was how the Cold War began, not with explosions or victory parades, but with whispers, glances, and choices made in quiet rooms. A world both divided and united by fear, and by an unspoken hope that someday the ice would melt. And as we drift further into that long twilight of history, one truth still lingers softly in the dark. Sometimes, what we fear most is not the enemy across the ocean, but the reflection of ourselves, staring back through the fog of time. It began with walls, some of concrete, others invisible, all of them built out of fear. In the years after the war, as Europe tried to rebuild its soul, the world quietly split in two. From Washington to Moscow, two ideologies stared at each other like reflections in cracked glass, each convinced that the other carried the shadow of tyranny. It was not just a political divide. It was a fracture in how people saw the future, how they defined freedom, how they dreamed. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in a small town in Missouri. His words fell like a curtain of iron. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Those words did not build the wall, but they gave it a name. Behind that curtain lay a world sealed off from the West, where nations like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia found themselves under the watchful eye of Moscow. In the West, the United States responded not with armies, but with promises. Promises wrapped in dollars, in democracy, and in the glittering idea of prosperity. The Marshall Plan poured money into Europe, rebuilding cities from the ashes and hearts from despair. To the East, it looked less like generosity and more like seduction, a golden hand extended, but only if one accepted the terms of the West. Stalin refused the offer, calling it a trap, and instead created his own circle of loyalty. Two halves of the same continent began to live different versions of the same dream. One side rebuilt in color, the other in shades of gray. Ordinary lives became pieces in a silent contest. In Berlin, families were divided not by war, but by politics. One morning, a man could cross the street to visit his sister. By evening, the street was guarded by soldiers. Love letters were sent, but never received. Radio waves carried laughter that could no longer be shared. The city became a living scar, a reminder that even the heart of Europe could be split by belief. And yet, even in division, there was beauty. Western Europe bloomed with jazz, cinema, and the bright promise of consumer life. Cafes buzzed with talk of freedom, and posters promised a new world built on choice. Meanwhile, across the curtain, another kind of dream took shape: unity, equality, a society where no one would be left behind. But dreams, when enforced, can turn to discipline, and discipline, when unyielding, begins to feel like silence. At night, radios from both sides hummed with competing stories. In the West, the Voice of America promised liberty in every language. In the East, propaganda spoke of capitalist greed and imperial decay. It was a war fought not with guns, but with words. Each side told its people the same story, that they were the ones protecting the future, that truth belonged only to them. And somewhere between those broadcasts, truth began to fade. To a child in London, the East was a mysterious land of red flags and long queues. To a child in Moscow, the West was a glittering lie, a place where the rich feasted while the poor starved. Neither child knew the other's face, yet both grew up believing the other's world was dangerous. Fear became the most effective border of all. In 1949, the world's first great alliances were born: NATO in the West, and later the Warsaw Pact in the East. They were meant to defend, but they also defined. The more one side armed itself for peace, the more the other prepared for defense. The cycle was endless, a choreography of suspicion, danced to the rhythm of mistrust. It was as if the entire world had learned to breathe differently, inhaling caution and exhaling restraint. But history is never only about leaders and armies. It is also about quiet acts of rebellion that go unnoticed. In Prague, students whispered banned poetry. In East Berlin, a woman tuned her radio just slightly to the left to catch a forbidden song from the West. In Paris, philosophers debated whether freedom could ever be pure if it depended on fear. And in every home, parents told their children stories not of victory, but of survival. One evening in 1961, construction began in Berlin. Workers laid bricks through the night, and by morning, the wall stood where the city's veins once crossed. It grew higher each day, crowned with barbed wire and guarded by men who were just as afraid as those they watched. Families waved across the divide, not knowing that years would pass before their hands could touch again. The wall was meant to protect an ideology, but it ended up imprisoning hearts. For people on both sides, the Cold War became a strange kind of normal. Life continued. Children went to school. Lovers met in secret. The seasons changed, but beneath it all ran an invisible current of tension. Every celebration carried an undertone of caution, every silence a weight. Yet somehow, humanity adapted. It learned to live within borders drawn by belief. In America, the suburbs filled with new homes, each with a television glowing like a tiny sundae. Families watched the news, listening to stories of communists and spies, while the world outside their door seemed calm and predictable. In the Soviet Union, the same glow came from factory lights burning through the night, a symbol of collective strength and endless work. Two ways of life, both promising happiness, both haunted by the fear of failure. The Cold War was never only fought in capitals. It lived in living rooms. It existed in the books people were allowed or forbidden to read, in the jokes they told when no one was listening, in the glances exchanged between strangers who suspected they were being watched. It was a conflict that invaded the private corners of the human soul. But beyond the fear, there was a strange kind of symmetry. Both sides dreamed of safety. Both wanted their children to grow up without war. Both believed they were the guardians of civilization. It was as if humanity had divided itself in half, each side fighting to prove it was the better mirror. And in doing so, it forgot that the reflection was shared. The walls that rose during those years were never just made of stone or steel. They were made of memory, of pain, of pride. They reminded everyone that peace, when divided, is fragile, and that freedom, when claimed by force, can start to look like a prison. Even now, decades later, when the real walls have fallen, the echoes remain. You can still feel them in the way nations speak to each other, in the way trust is offered carefully, in the way borders, though invisible, still hum beneath the surface of the world. The Iron Curtain may have disappeared from the maps, but in many ways, it still drapes the mind. The Cold War did not end a story, it wrote the script for the one we are still living. And somewhere, in the quiet between two worlds, there lingers a question that no side ever truly answered. If the world could be divided so completely by fear, what kind of love or courage will it take to bring it together again? The Cold War, though fought with words and warnings, soon began to draw real blood. Not the blood of superpowers, but of smaller nations caught in their shadow. It was a war that no one officially declared, and yet it burned through jungles, deserts, and city streets, leaving behind graves that belonged to people who never knew what they were dying for. In the early 1950 seconds, the Korean Peninsula became the first great tragedy of this quiet conflict. The world had barely caught its breath from the Second World War, when the North crossed the 38th parallel, and the South called for help. The United States entered in the name of freedom. China entered in the name of revolution. For 3 years, fire rained on mountains and villages until the land itself seemed to bleed. When the war finally froze into a ceasefire, the world was no different, only more afraid. Families were split by an invisible line, and a generation of soldiers carried home memories they would never speak aloud. The Korean War was supposed to be a lesson. Instead, it became a warning ignored. The lesson was that in a world divided by ideology, every local war could become global overnight. But men in power rarely learn from ashes. They look for new fields to test their will. And so, a decade later, another war began to brew. In a land of green rivers and rice paddies, Vietnam. It started as a whisper, a promise to protect democracy from the spread of communism. Advisors arrived first, then soldiers, then bombs. To the Americans, it was a mission. To the Vietnamese, it was survival. Villages burned, forests glowed red at midnight, and the line between right and wrong blurred in the smoke. The superpowers stayed safe in their capitals while the young bled in their name. What made Vietnam different was that for the first time, the war came home through the television screen. Every evening, families in America sat before their dinner plates and watched napalm fall on strangers' homes. The distance between continents vanished. The moral certainty that had defined the post-war years began to crumble. People marched, chanted, refused to fight. The Cold War, once a matter of governments, now lived in every living room. And yet, Vietnam was not unique. It was only the loudest of the proxy wars, the battles where the superpowers tested their strength through the bodies of others. In Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa, revolutions bloomed like wildflowers and withered just as fast. The United States armed one side, the Soviets armed the other. Dictators rose and fell, not because of what they believed, but because of who supplied their guns. In Cuba, the story took a different shape. It began with music and revolution, with the bearded faces of young men promising change. But when Fidel Castro embraced the Soviet Union, the island became the most dangerous dot on the world map. In October 1962, the world stood closer to nuclear war than it ever had before or since. For 13 days, two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back. It is easy now to forget how close the world came to ending. In those days, every clock ticked like a heartbeat. Submarine captains waited for orders that could erase cities. Children practiced hiding under desks, though everyone knew wood could not stop fire. And then, suddenly, it was over not with a bomb, but with restraint. Two men who had never met chose to step back. History, for once, exhaled. But even peace has its price. After Cuba, both sides learned that war was too costly to fight directly, so they turned to subtler weapons: money, propaganda, and influence. Wars became quieter, but not less cruel. In Central America, farmers picked up rifles. In Afghanistan, tribes became soldiers. Each conflict carried the fingerprints of powers that pretended they weren't there. What makes proxy wars haunting is not their scale, but their silence. They were not celebrated with parades or marked by clear victories. They began in secrecy and ended in exhaustion. For those who lived through them, there was no glory, only grief. Mothers buried sons without knowing whose dream they had died for. Somewhere in a small village, a boy carried his father's rifle and never learned why the enemy spoke a different language. In the capital of a distant country, a general toasted success while maps were redrawn in rooms without windows. The Cold War did not only divide nations, it divided truth itself. By the late 1970s, a strange weariness settled over the world. The superpowers had spent decades playing chess with human lives. They had won influence, yes, but lost something harder to name. The moral certainty of both sides had withered. What good is victory, people began to ask, if it must always be built on someone else's ruin? Still, the machine of ideology turned on. The Soviet Union pushed deeper into Africa, aiding liberation movements and installing friendly regimes. The United States answered with its own alliances, whispering the word freedom while supporting men whose hands were far from clean. But amid all the destruction, small acts of compassion kept humanity alive. American doctors crossed borders to treat the wounded. Soviet engineers built schools in deserts they had never seen before. Somewhere between propaganda and survival, people found ways to be human. Because even when nations fight, individuals still dream. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan reopened the wounds that had barely healed. Once again, mountains turned to battlefields, and young men fought wars older than they were. The West supplied weapons to rebels. The East sent soldiers, and another generation learned that ideology could be a curse disguised as duty. When the Soviets finally withdrew a decade later, they left behind nothing but dust, ghosts, and a future no one could control. Every proxy war carried the same echo, a sense of déjà vu, of lessons unlearned. The same speeches were given, the same promises made, the same graves dug. It was as if the world had fallen into a trance, repeating the same song of power and fear. The lyrics changed, but the melody remained. Looking back now, it's hard to say what was won. The map of influence shifted, but at what cost? Nations rose and fell, but the people, always the people, paid the price. The Cold War's blood was never spilled by the hands that planned it. It flowed quietly, staining lands whose names most politicians could not even pronounce. And yet, these wars did something neither superpower intended. They connected humanity through suffering. A mother in Vietnam, a widow in Angola, a refugee in Kabul, all shared the same silent prayer. For the world to stop choosing sides long enough to remember what peace feels like. That, perhaps, is the truest legacy of the Cold War's shadow wars. They taught the world that ideology, no matter how noble it sounds, becomes monstrous when it forgets the faces of those who bear its weight. The Cold War promised a battle for the soul of humanity, but it was humanity itself that became the battlefield. And somewhere between those forgotten jungles and barren deserts, under the smoke and slogans, something fragile but enduring remained the small, stubborn heartbeat of compassion. It pulsed quietly through doctors tending the wounded, journalists writing forbidden truths, and strangers who still believed in kindness despite everything. The world would go on building alliances and testing weapons, but in the spaces between explosions, life kept returning. A seed grew where a bomb had fallen. A song was sung in a language both sides could understand. And in that fragile, fleeting beauty, the Cold War revealed its cruelest irony, that even in an age built on fear, the human spirit refused to surrender. Because for all its battles and borders, the Cold War was never truly about nations. It was about us, all of us, trying to prove we were right, when what we really needed was to remember we were the same. It was strange how, in the middle of fear, humanity began to look upward. The Cold War had taught people to watch the skies for bombs, yet it was the same sky that would soon hold their greatest dreams. Out of suspicion came ambition, and out of rivalry, a quiet, accidental poetry. Two nations racing to touch the stars, not to conquer them, but to prove they could. It began with a beep. In 1957, a small silver sphere named Sputnik circled the Earth, sending out a faint pulse that echoed through every radio on the planet. It was simple, just a metallic heartbeat, but it sounded like a challenge. In suburban America, children looked up at the night sky and wondered if that dot of light belonged to them anymore. In Moscow, crowds gathered in pride, whispering that the future had arrived first in Russian. For the first time, humanity could hear itself orbiting in the dark. Fear, once grounded in borders and bombs, suddenly lifted into the heavens. If a satellite could fly above nations, so could a missile. Every launch became both a triumph and a warning. Yet, beneath that tension, there was wonder, a feeling too human to suppress. The same rockets that could destroy cities were now carrying pieces of hope beyond the clouds. The United States responded quickly, and in 1958, NASA was born. Its first offices were modest, tucked in old army buildings where young scientists worked late into the night, surrounded by chalkboards and coffee cups. They weren't soldiers, and they weren't politicians, they were dreamers. Many of them had grown up watching the same wars that divided the world. Now they were building something meant to unite it. The space race became the most beautiful competition in history. It was rivalry painted in starlight. Each achievement from one side became an invitation for the other to go further. When the Soviet Union sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961, the world held its breath. A single man was now circling the planet, seeing what no human eyes had ever seen. "I see Earth," he said softly over the radio. "It is beautiful." And for a moment, it didn't matter which flag was stitched to his sleeve, because everyone listening felt that beauty too. But beauty, in the Cold War, was never left unguarded. The Americans answered with their own dream, to put a man on the moon. It was an audacious promise, spoken by a young president with a voice that trembled between conviction and hope. "We choose to go to the moon," John F. Kennedy declared, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Those words, carried through television static, reminded the world that ambition could be noble even in an age of fear. Behind the speeches were thousands of quiet miracles. Engineers calculated trajectories by hand. Women, often ignored in the headlines, ran the numbers that would keep men alive in space. Factories built machines lighter than air, but strong enough to touch eternity. The world was divided on the ground, yet above the atmosphere, it seemed humanity had finally remembered how to dream together. Then came the night of the 20th of July, 1969. A gray, dusty world appeared on black and white screens across the earth. People watched in bars, in schools, in tiny apartments lit only by the glow of television sets. When Neil Armstrong's boot pressed into the lunar soil, time itself seemed to pause. "That's one small step for man," he said. "One giant leap for mankind." And in that single sentence, the Cold War lost its meaning. For once, victory didn't taste of conquest, it tasted of wonder. But wonder, like everything else in that era, came with a shadow. Behind the scenes, the race to the stars drained billions of dollars and pushed nations to their limits. While astronauts walked on the moon, soldiers still fought in jungles, and hungry families still waited for food. The stars inspired, yes, but they also distracted. Each success above the sky made it easier to ignore the pain below. In the Soviet Union, the cost was heavy. The same brilliance that had launched Gagarin also built machines that often failed in silence. Cosmonauts died in capsules that never reached orbit, their names hidden from newspapers. Pride demanded perfection, and so tragedy was buried. Yet in those hidden sacrifices lay something profoundly human, the willingness to risk everything for a dream no one had ever touched. By the 1,970 seconds, the competition began to soften. The two great rivals, exhausted by their own ambitions, slowly learned the meaning of cooperation. Apollo met Soyuz in orbit in 1975, an American spacecraft and a Soviet one, docking together like two hands, finally shaking after decades of suspicion. The image of astronauts floating between them was quiet but revolutionary. Men from opposing worlds sharing air in the same small capsule, laughing as they drifted above the Earth. That laughter was the real victory of the space race, not who arrived first, but that they had arrived together at last. It was proof that even in an age defined by fear, curiosity could still outshine hatred. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside, both sides understood that their rivalry had created something larger than politics. They had shown humanity what it was capable of when imagination overcame fear. The space race also changed how we saw ourselves. For the first time, photographs returned from space showing Earth not as a map divided by borders, but as a fragile blue sphere floating in darkness. Those images did what no treaty ever could. They made us realize how small we really were. Astronauts and cosmonauts alike spoke of it later, how the view from above made them feel both insignificant and deeply connected. From up there, one said, there are no lines, only home. Back on the ground, that revelation began to seep into art, music, and thought. The era of endless expansion slowly gave way to a quieter awareness that progress without meaning is hollow. The Cold War had begun with fear of annihilation, but it had also, paradoxically, taught humanity to look beyond itself. Even as tensions remained, the dream of space endured. Children grew up wanting to be astronauts, not soldiers. The moon became a symbol not of who won, but of what could be achieved when people refused to be confined by gravity or by ideology. The rockets that once symbolized destruction now carried whispers of hope. And though the Cold War continued, its sharpest edges began to soften under the weight of shared wonder. What the space race proved, perhaps more than anything, was that competition, when guided by vision, can elevate rather than destroy. It showed that rivalry could give birth to progress, that even enemies could push each other toward greatness. For a brief, fragile moment in history, the sky became common ground. And as humanity looked upward, something shifted deep within. The Cold War was still raging on Earth, but above it all, there was silence, vast, infinite, and free of fear. In that silence, the world saw its reflection, small, flawed, but capable of beauty. The race to space began as an act of defiance and ended as a quiet reminder that our greatest victories are never about who stands higher, but who dares to reach together. The rockets would one day rust, the footprints on the moon would fade, but the memory of that shared gaze toward the stars would remain. Because long before peace was signed, before walls fell and nations changed, the sky had already taught humanity its most precious lesson, that even in a divided world, we have always shared the same horizon. In the Cold War, truth itself became a battlefield. No guns, no bombs, just words, images, and whispers that could wound deeper than any bullet. The wars of soldiers had left cities in ruins, but now came a subtler war, one that sought not to conquer land, but to shape the way people thought. It began quietly, through the static of radios and the flicker of television screens. In both East and West, entire nations woke each morning to the same question. Though few ever said it aloud, What can I still believe? Propaganda had always existed, but the Cold War turned it into an art form. Refined, scientific, almost beautiful in its precision. Every movie, every headline, every song hummed with hidden meaning. It was a world where truth had many versions, and all of them sounded certain. In the United States, glossy posters spoke of freedom, family, and faith. Smiling faces under clean skies, hands clutching the flag. America became its own myth, bright, prosperous, invincible. The message was clear. Here, you can dream. And perhaps that dream was true for some, but the dream itself became the weapon. The West learned that the most powerful way to win hearts was to make people want your life more than their own. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union answered with its own symphony of words and images. Billboards showed workers with strong arms and radiant faces, the sun rising behind factories, a future painted in red and gold. The collective was the hero, not the individual. The message was equally simple. Here, you belong to something greater than yourself. It was the promise of equality, spoken in parades, carved in monuments, whispered in classrooms. Two competing myths, each claiming to be the truth. And somewhere in between them, ordinary people lived their lives, balancing on a tightrope between hope and doubt. Cinema became the new front line. In Hollywood, spies and villains always seemed to speak Russian. The enemy was faceless but familiar, cold, logical, godless. And in Moscow, filmmakers returned the favor. Westerners were portrayed as greedy and shallow, slaves to money and pleasure. In dark theaters across the world, people learned to fear each other without ever meeting. Yet, even in manipulation, there was something human. Both sides used art not only to deceive, but also to dream. The melodies of American jazz slipped secretly across borders, carried by radio waves into eastern nights. Young men in gray Soviet apartments turned the volume low and listened to forbidden saxophones, hearing in that rhythm something freer than words. And at the same time, Western artists flirted with socialist ideals, believing, perhaps naively, that equality could still be beautiful if stripped of its chains. The Cold War turned the human imagination into its most precious resource. Scientists invented weapons, but artists invented meaning. In poetry and music, resistance found its voice. Behind the Iron Curtain, writers like Pasternak and Solzhenitsyn used fiction to tell forbidden truths, smuggling courage between pages. Their books were banned, but still, they traveled past hand to hand like secret prayers. In the West, singers wrote protest songs that asked dangerous questions. What good is victory if its silence is love? The fear of nuclear annihilation pressed on everyone, but culture gave people a way to breathe. While governments shouted, art whispered, and the whispers carried further. One of the strangest battles of the Cold War was fought not in the sky or the sea, but through sound. The United States created the Voice of America, a radio program broadcasting music, news, and hope across Soviet borders. The Soviets jammed the frequencies, flooding the air with static, but still, the voices slipped through. Somewhere in Leningrad, a young woman turned the dial and caught half a sentence from another world. That was all it took to remind her that silence was not complete. And the East responded in kind. The Soviet Union funded its own radio, Radio Moscow, broadcasting to the West about the hypocrisy of capitalism and the suffering it ignored. The words clashed invisibly in the air, filling the space between nations with a chorus of conviction. It was as if truth itself had become bilingual, fluent in contradiction. At home, people learned to read between the lines. In the East, truth was hidden under official slogans. In the West, it was buried under advertisements. Both sides wore masks, and both learned to smile through fear. But deep down, everyone understood the same thing. Whoever controlled the story controlled the soul. And yet, despite the manipulation, something unexpected grew out of it: curiosity. The more one side tried to seal itself off, the more its people wanted to know what lay beyond. Jeans, rock and roll, blue jeans, and Coca-Cola, symbols of the West, became forbidden fruit in the East. Owning a record from the Beatles could be a quiet act of rebellion. At the same time, in the West, the image of the stoic Soviet worker fascinated intellectuals, who saw in it a kind of moral purity that capitalism had lost. The Cold War was a mirror that both sides used to see themselves more clearly, even if they didn't like the reflection. Television magnified everything. In America, every broadcast was wrapped in optimism. The family around the dinner table, the car gleaming in the driveway, the future glowing in technicolor. It was a promise of order in a world that still trembled. In the Soviet Union, newsreels showed parades and achievements, always forward, always triumphant. Reality was edited for comfort, just like in the West. Different stories, same illusion. And then came advertising, the weapon the East never truly mastered. In the West, persuasion became poetry. Commercials didn't just sell products, they sold purpose. Buy this, and you'll belong. Wear this, and you'll be seen. The Cold War turned capitalism into theater, where even toothpaste could feel like freedom. It was a glittering dream, polished nightly until no one could tell where reality ended. But perhaps the most haunting weapon of all was silence, the things that could not be said. In Moscow, a careless joke could lead to exile. In Washington, a rumor could destroy a career. McCarthyism and censorship were reflections of each other, two different costumes for the same fear. People learned to speak carefully, to hide their true thoughts behind smiles. Whole generations grew up fluent in the language of caution. And yet, in that silence, resilience grew. Humor became rebellion. A whispered joke was an act of defiance. A banned poem was a declaration of life. Art thrived in the cracks of fear because truth, like water, always finds a way through. By the 1980 seconds, the Cold War had created a strange paradox, a world more connected than ever, yet more divided in belief. Satellites broadcast news instantly, but trust had vanished. Propaganda had done its job too well. No one believed anyone anymore. The battle for truth had consumed truth itself. But even that exhaustion carried its own wisdom. People began to see through the noise. The loudest voices sounded hollow, and in the quiet spaces between songs, between broadcasts, between the static, something gentle began to return. A sense that maybe the world didn't need to be conquered, just understood. Because in the end, the war of words taught us what bombs never could, that control over truth is always temporary. Stories shift, myths crumble, but the need to connect, to speak, to listen, to believe remains. The Cold War may have been a war of ideologies, but it was fought by storytellers, and it was won, if it was ever won at all, by the side that remembered how to make people dream. And when the noise finally faded, what lingered was not propaganda, but the quiet ache of recognition that beneath all the banners and lies, both East and West had been telling the same story all along, the story of what it means to be human, longing to be heard. There was a time when every sunset carried a question no one dared to ask out loud. Will the world still be here tomorrow? The Cold War had reached its quietest and most dangerous form, a tension so constant that people learned to live with it, the way one grows used to the ticking of a clock that might stop at any moment. The atomic bomb had ended one war, and in doing so, had promised the next. Its light had seared cities and shadows alike, and the image of Hiroshima was burned not just into photographs, but into the collective memory of humankind. The years that followed were haunted by that image. Small children in classrooms learning how to duck and cover, office workers glancing at sirens mounted on rooftops, entire cities practicing how to survive what no one could survive. The age of anxiety had begun. Across the world, a strange stillness crept into daily life. People smiled, worked, fell in love, raised children, but underneath, the fear hummed softly, like static. Everyone knew that somewhere, far away, men sat in rooms filled with buttons, and that a single mistake could erase everything. It wasn't the fear of death that frightened people most. It was the fear of nothingness, the idea that one day there would be no trace left of the songs, the books, the laughter, or the small kindnesses that made life worth living. In the United States, the government built networks of underground shelters. Families were encouraged to stock food, water, and flashlights. Magazines published cheerful guides on how to survive the blast, as if apocalypse could be domesticated. In the Soviet Union, drills became routine. School children marched into basements, singing songs of patriotism to drown out their terror. The world had split into two halves of the same nightmare. The arms race accelerated. Nuclear tests painted the sky with fire. Islands in the Pacific glowed with radioactive storms, their names erased from maps for decades. Soldiers watched from a distance, their eyes shielded by glass, their hearts echoing with the same disbelief that this was real, that humanity had built something capable of unmaking itself. And yet, amid the horror, there was a peculiar fascination. Scientists spoke of megaton yields and deterrent strategies with the calm of mathematicians, as if annihilation were an equation to be solved. Politicians smiled on television and promised safety through strength. But ordinary people, artists, poets, lovers, understood something deeper. They sensed that power built on fear cannot protect anything. It only feeds the shadow it claims to fight. The 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds became a paradox of comfort and dread. New cars gleamed in suburban driveways, but above those perfect neighborhoods hung the invisible weight of the bomb. Television screens flickered with sitcoms and mushroom clouds. Music oscillated between joy and despair. Love songs carried the tremor of goodbye. And still, people tried to pretend that everything was fine, because what else could they do? In Moscow, in Washington, in London, the night sky no longer symbolized mystery. It was a reminder of vulnerability. Early warning systems scanned the horizon. Radar dishes spun without rest, and computers measured the trajectory of hypothetical missiles that no one hoped to see. The line between imagination and fear became blurred. Children dreamed of fire. Adults dreamed of silence. The planet itself felt smaller, fragile, as if held together only by the thin thread of mutual caution. Art began to reflect this unease. Films like Dr. Strangelove and The Day After turned dread into dark humor and bleak realism. Painters splashed color onto canvases as if trying to capture chaos before it arrived. Writers described futures where humanity survived only by forgetting how to feel. Even religion changed its tone. Priests and monks spoke less of sin and more of mercy, as if pleading with the heavens to remember what humans could not. But the fear was not without purpose. In a strange, almost poetic way, it kept the world from burning. Each side knew that pressing the button would end not just the enemy, but everything they loved. That knowledge, terrifying, humbling, became a kind of peace. A peace built not on trust, but on shared vulnerability. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was grotesque and yet oddly human. If we cannot live together, at least we can die together. This uneasy balance shaped generations. Young lovers held each other closer. Artists created more urgently. Every heartbeat felt borrowed. And somewhere deep inside, people began to ask whether all this fear might hold a lesson, whether the threat of extinction could teach humanity how precious life truly was. The arms race also gave birth to strange marvels. Out of the pursuit of destruction came technology that would one day connect and heal. Rocket science, nuclear energy, satellite communication, all born from the desire to conquer fear, and yet destined to outlive it. It was as if the universe refused to let terror be our only legacy, and still, accidents happened. In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov sat in a dark command room when alarms began to sound. Computers reported that American missiles were on their way. Protocol demanded he retaliate. Instead, he hesitated. He waited, listening to his instinct rather than the machine. Minutes passed. No missiles came. His disobedience saved the world. No headline ever bore his name. Moments like that, small, quiet acts of courage, became the real story of the Cold War's age of fear. Humanity survived, not through power, but through restraint. Through the simple, miraculous decision, again and again, not to destroy. The world did not end because someone, somewhere, chose compassion over calculation. But the psychological scars lingered. The constant threat seeped into dreams, into language, into the rhythm of everyday thought. People began to measure happiness by its fragility. Even laughter carried a faint echo of defiance, as if to say, "We are still here." By the 1980 seconds, when the tension began to soften, it was not triumph people felt, but exhaustion. Decades of anxiety had left the human spirit tender, almost translucent. Yet out of that weariness emerged something profound: empathy, a recognition that fear is universal, and that beneath the flags and ideologies, everyone had been afraid of the same thing: losing the world they love. In that shared fear lay the first fragile thread of understanding. The Cold War had shown humanity its reflection, distorted and trembling. But once you see your own fragility, it becomes harder to hate. The arms that once built bombs began to reach out. Leaders met, spoke, hesitated less. Children born in that decade grew up not fearing the end, but wondering how their parents had lived with it for so long. And perhaps that was the quiet gift of the age of anxiety, that it forced humanity to see the thinness of the line it walked. To realize that peace, true peace, is not the absence of danger, but the presence of conscience. Every so often, when a siren sounds or a headline warns of conflict, the old fear stirs again. It whispers from the corners of memory, "Remember what almost happened." And yet, alongside that whisper is another voice, softer and wiser, the voice that says, "Remember who stopped it." The world learned to coexist with its own shadow, to find meaning even in uncertainty. The fear never vanished, but it changed shape. It became awareness, humility, a reminder of how easily light can be lost and how fiercely it must be protected. And as the years passed, that invisible hum of dread faded into the background of daily life. But every night, when people looked up at the same dark sky once filled with tests and threats, they saw something else now. Not doom, not warning, just stars, quiet, distant, eternal. Proof that even after the darkest fears, beauty endures. Because in the end, the Cold War's greatest paradox was this: by teaching humanity how to destroy itself, it also taught us, in a whisper more enduring than any siren, the value of simply being alive. By the late 1980 seconds, the Cold War began to lose its breath. It did not end with explosions or fanfare, but with sighs, quiet, cautious, almost tender. For decades, the world had lived suspended between two fears: the fear of the other and the fear of what it might become itself. But exhaustion, that most human of emotions, proved stronger than ideology. The mighty engines of propaganda began to rust. The grand speeches sounded hollow. And for the first time in nearly half a century, both sides started to wonder if they were still fighting an enemy or merely fighting their own reflection. In Moscow, a new leader stepped forward: Mikhail Gorbachev. He was younger, thoughtful, and, in the eyes of the old guard, dangerously idealistic. He spoke not of conquest, but of renewal, words the Soviet Union had long forgotten how to pronounce. Perestroika. He called it restructuring. And glasnost, openness. Beautiful words, fragile as glass. He promised a new dawn, and though few believed him at first, the world leaned in to listen. The Soviet Union was a tired empire. Its people stood in endless lines for bread. Its factories, once symbols of power, had become monuments to inefficiency. Its soldiers returned from Afghanistan not as heroes, but as ghosts. The dream that had once painted the sky red had faded into gray. Gorbachev, in his quiet way, tried to paint it again with honesty instead of slogans. He loosened censorship, allowed criticism, and invited the West to speak. It was an act of courage and of risk. Because when you open the windows of a house long sealed, fresh air is not the only thing that enters dust, and truth come in too. In the West, leaders responded not with threats, but with curiosity. Ronald Reagan, who had once called the Soviet Union an evil empire, met Gorbachev face to face. Their first encounter, in Geneva in 1985, was tense but strangely human. Two men, representing two worlds, sat across from each other and talked not as generals, but as grandfathers, men old enough to be tired of hatred. The photographs from that meeting are still haunting. Two smiles, cautious but real, like sunlight filtering through clouds. The following years unfolded like the slow thaw of spring. Agreements were signed. Missiles were dismantled. The numbers of warheads, those silent symbols of fear, began to shrink. The world exhaled, softly. It was not yet peace, but it was something gentler, a pause, a possibility. And then, almost unexpectedly, walls began to crack. Not metaphorical ones, but real, concrete ones. In Eastern Europe, the long frozen air began to stir. People whispered words like freedom and hope, in languages that had been forbidden to dream for generations. In Poland, the solidarity movement grew stronger. In Hungary, borders quietly opened. And in East Germany, a tide of courage rose that no army could hold back. On the evening of the 9th of November 1989, in Berlin, confusion turned into miracle. A press conference, a misread statement, and suddenly, word spread that the border was open. People ran to the checkpoints, unsure if it was true. Soldiers, equally unsure, hesitated and then, almost shyly, stepped aside. And then the sound began. The first cracks of hammers striking the Berlin Wall. For 28 years, that wall had divided not just a city, but the human heart. Now, under the cold November sky, it began to crumble. Strangers hugged. Families reunited. Young people climbed to the top, waving flags, dancing, crying. Pieces of the wall fell into the crowd, into hands that had waited a lifetime to feel free. And across the world, television screens flickered with images that looked almost unreal. The wall that had defined a century was gone not by invasion, but by the collective will of those who refused to fear anymore. In the Kremlin, Gorbachev watched as history rewrote itself. He could have sent tanks, as his predecessors had done in Budapest or Prague, but he didn't. He let it happen. And that single act of restraint, rather than control, changed the fate of millions. The empire, once held together by fear, began to dissolve in peace. But the fall of walls does not mean the end of burdens. As Eastern Europe tasted freedom, it also faced hunger, uncertainty, chaos. Ideals collided with reality. Yet for those who had lived half their lives behind barbed wire, even chaos felt like oxygen. In Prague, crowds filled Wenceslas Square, ringing keys as symbols of change. In Warsaw, churches overflowed with prayers, not of faith, but of gratitude. And in Moscow, for the first time in living memory, people spoke openly in the streets without looking over their shoulders. The transformation was not just political, it was emotional. Generations raised in silence suddenly found their voices. And in the West, people watched with wonder and disbelief, realizing that the enemy they had feared for so long had never truly been a monster, only another version of themselves, just as fragile, just as human. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself began to unravel. One by one, its republics declared independence. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, small names once buried under the weight of empire, stood proudly once more. The red flag that had flown over the Kremlin for 70 years was lowered for the last time on a winter night. It did not fall in flames. It was folded carefully, almost lovingly, as if history itself wanted to honor what had once been, even as it let it go. For the people who lived through it, the end of the Cold War was not a victory march, but a quiet awakening. No bells rang, no treaties proclaimed triumph. There was relief, yes, but also confusion. For half a century, the world had been defined by its divisions. Now, standing in the dawn of a new age, people looked around and realized they no longer knew who they were without their enemies. The United States celebrated, of course, but behind the parades lay an unspoken question. What happens to a hero when the villain disappears? Factories that once built missiles now built silence. Soldiers returned home to peace, but not always to purpose. The same happened in Russia, though in reverse. An empire that had once commanded fear found itself suddenly poor, uncertain, adrift. People sold their medals to buy bread. Ideology was replaced by survival. And yet, amid the disarray, there was hope, a fragile, human hope that perhaps the world could start again. Scientists who had designed weapons now dreamed of curing disease. Artists who had painted propaganda now painted the truth. Children, born after the fall, grew up in a world without air raid drills, without the constant shadow of annihilation. The sky, once filled with satellites of suspicion, now seemed open again, wide and forgiving. The Cold War ended not because one side defeated the other, but because both finally understood how much they had to lose. The men who led the final years, Gorbachev, Reagan, Bush, were not perfect, but they were weary. And sometimes, weariness is what saves us. It softens the hand, slows the trigger, makes us remember that peace, however fragile, is still worth choosing. Looking back, the collapse of the Soviet Union feels inevitable, as if it were always destined to end this way. But at the time, it felt miraculous, too gentle to be true. The greatest conflict of the modern world faded not with a bang, but with the quiet murmur of people daring to live differently. And that may be the most extraordinary part of all, that after decades of fear and division, the world ended its longest war not through conquest, but through the simple, stubborn act of letting go. Because, in the end, history does not always turn on battles or revolutions. Sometimes, it changes when someone decides to stop fighting. And as the last echoes of the Cold War faded into the hum of ordinary life, humanity learned, for a brief and precious moment, what it felt like to breathe freely again. When the dust of the Cold War finally settled, the world did not awaken into peace. It awoke into silence. A strange, uncertain quiet. The kind that follows a long argument when both sides forget what they were fighting for. The great ideologies had collapsed, the walls had fallen, and the missiles, for the most part, were sleeping. But in that stillness lingered a question that no one could quite answer. What happens to the world when its greatest fear disappears? At first, it felt like a victory. The newspapers printed headlines of hope. The age of reason had triumphed. The free world had prevailed. But underneath the celebrations, something more delicate was stirring. A sense that the world was entering a new chapter, one without a script. The Cold War had shaped everything: politics, art, identity, even the way people dreamed. Now, with the enemy gone, the mirror that had defined both East and West cracked, and everyone saw themselves reflected back, unfamiliar and exposed. In the United States, the 1,990 seconds began with confidence. The economy soared, the internet was born, and for the first time, a generation grew up without the shadow of nuclear fear. But power, like gravity, never disappears. It simply shifts. Without a rival, America stood alone at the center of the world, unsure whether to guide it or to own it. The victory that once united the West began to blur into complacency, then into arrogance. For decades, the Cold War had been a story of two sides. Now there was only one narrator, and the story began to lose its balance. In Russia, the story was different. The empire that had ruled a sixth of the earth was suddenly gone, leaving behind confusion and hunger. Old flags were burned, new ones were stitched in haste. The ruble collapsed, and along with it, the certainty that life, however hard, had meaning. Men who once built missiles now sold vegetables in frozen markets. Scientists became taxi drivers. Entire generations, who had been told they were part of history's vanguard, now felt like relics of a dream that had ended mid-sentence. And yet, life went on. Children were born, trains still ran, and somewhere, despite everything, laughter returned. Freedom came, but it came hungry, demanding, chaotic, beautiful, and cruel. It brought choices where once there had been only orders. Some learned to thrive in it, others drowned. For every millionaire who rose from the ashes, there was a mother who sold her wedding ring to buy bread. For every statue that was torn down, a memory remained, whispering that not all walls fall cleanly. Elsewhere, the ripples of the Cold War continued to spread. The conflicts it had frozen in place began to thaw. In the Balkans, the old fault lines of history reopened. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Sarajevo, once a symbol of coexistence, became a city under siege. It was as if the world, released from one fear, had rediscovered its smaller, older ones, tribal, ethnic, ancient. The peace the world had expected after 1991 did not arrive. It merely changed its shape. And while tanks no longer faced each other across European plains, new weapons emerged, quieter, invisible, digital. The wars of the 21st century would not be fought with armies, but with algorithms. Power shifted from steel to information, from land to data. Spies became hackers. Battles moved from deserts to computer screens. The Iron Curtain had fallen, but in its place rose 1,000 firewalls. The same technology that promised connection also carried division. The Internet, that shimmering miracle of the post-Cold War world, became both a bridge and a labyrinth. Information flowed freely, but truth became slippery again, dressed in new disguises. Old propaganda returned in new forms: tweets instead of posters, algorithms instead of slogans. The Cold War had ended, but its lessons had not been learned. Humanity, once terrified of nuclear winter, now faced something quieter, slower, and just as dangerous: the erosion of meaning. And yet, amid that confusion, something remarkable persisted: the memory of restraint. The knowledge that for 45 years the world had lived on the edge of extinction and had somehow chosen not to fall. That memory, buried deep in the global psyche, became a kind of compass. Even as nations quarreled, even as new powers rose, there lingered the ghost of caution, the echo of those who once stood before the abyss and stepped back. The Cold War, in its strange way, had made humanity grow up. It had shown us the limits of fear, the futility of pride, the fragility of life. It taught us that technology could save or destroy us, depending on who held the switch. It revealed how easily truth can be shaped and how costly it is to forget our shared humanity. And though its monuments have crumbled, its fingerprints remain on our politics, our borders, our stories, even our dreams. Look closely at the world today, and you can still see its shadows. In the tension between democracy and control, in the suspicion between East and West, in the language of sanctions and alliances, the Cold War still breathes softly, like an old ghost that refuses to leave. Even the stars above carry its legacy: satellites orbiting Earth, born from the same rockets that once threatened to burn it. And yet, for all its scars, the Cold War left behind something else too: a strange, fragile hope. Because in surviving it, humanity proved something extraordinary: that fear does not have to win. That even when divided by ideology, We are bound by the same desires for safety, for love, for meaning. That history, though often cruel, is still capable of mercy. Sometimes, late at night, when the world grows quiet again, the old silence returns. Not the silence of dread, but of remembrance. The hum of machines, the glow of screens, the faint echo of a radio somewhere still playing, the songs that once crossed the Iron Curtain. And in that stillness, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the lesson the century tried to teach us, that survival is not victory, and peace is not something we inherit. It is something we must choose, again and again, in every age. The Cold War may have ended, but the war within us continues, the battle between fear and understanding, between isolation and connection, between the desire to control and the courage to trust. And maybe that is what history truly is, not the story of nations rising and falling, but the slow, stumbling progress of the human heart learning how to live without enemies. The world today moves faster than it ever has. Borders shift, alliances waver, and the horizon fills with new uncertainties. But behind it all, there is the same heartbeat that carried us through the last century, the quiet, stubborn pulse of people who refuse to surrender to despair. Because perhaps the real legacy of the Cold War is not the weapons it built or the walls it raised, but the invisible thread it left behind. A reminder of how close we came to losing everything, and how precious it is that we didn't. And as we drift into another twilight of history, under skies still lined with satellites, we carry that memory with us, not as fear, but as wisdom, a soft whisper echoing across time. That peace, no matter how fragile, is still the most daring dream of all. When the night grows quiet and the echoes of history begin to fade, I want to thank you for staying, for listening, and for feeling these stories with me. Every moment we share here is a small act of remembrance, a way of keeping the past alive, not through dates or battles, but through the quiet heartbeat of humanity that still connects us all. If tonight's story has stirred something in you, a thought, a memory, a quiet sense of wonder, then maybe, in some small way, the past has found a home in you too. So before you drift off into your own dreams, I'd like to gently invite you to stay with us, to subscribe, not as a follower, but as a companion on this journey through time. There are still so many stories waiting to be whispered under the light of another sunset. Until then, sleep softly, dream kindly, and remember, history never truly ends. It just waits for someone who still cares enough to listen. Good night.